Okay, welcome to Dark Roots Revision video tutorial. So I just wanted to go over a couple of things before you guys do your SAC next week. So yeah, here we go. So it was really interesting talking to Kate yesterday. Yep, today's Thursday, so it was yesterday. And I picked out a few things from that, and also have been thinking about I guess my own ideas about the collection. And when we look at the group of stories as a whole, there are a few consistent things that keep emerging. So thinking about the title, and as Kate said yesterday, the title of Dark Roots and the extended metaphor that really can carry across the whole collection. So, the dyeing your hair is symbolic of covering up something. And when your roots grow back, your dark roots grow back, that's the truth being revealed in some way. So there's a lot of things to do with secrets, concealing things, hiding things from view, darkness. That's really a lot of the stories are preoccupied with. And then, of course, as we've talked about, there's communication and there's relationships. So the idea that to have an effective relationship, to have a good relationship, you need good communication. And when you don't have good communication, then those relationships disintegrate and fall apart. So those are some things that you need to be aware of when you come to develop your own story. Kate Kennedy's tone, it alters from story to story. There are some stories that are really melancholy and really sad, where there are others that are quite humorous, although even the humorous ones still have a melancholy aspect to it. I mean, if you think about Habit and the fact that she is dying, but the nature of the story is quite humorous. The fact that she's concealing drugs and she's dressed up as a nun. So that's quite interesting. There's a lot to do with the mundane nature of everyday life, the malaise of everydayness. So just the sameness, things being the same all the time. Think about A Pitch Too High for the Human Ear. The ham and cheese, making those sandwiches over and over again, being symbolic of Andrew and Vicky's life at that point in time. And it's true life. Life is not dramatic event after dramatic event. It is typically mundane, boring, monotonous. And then it's a lot of the characters are stuck and they're stagnant and they're waiting for something to happen. And they're often frustrated. So you'll see that there's a lot of honesty in what Kennedy writes, in the voices of the protagonists usually. There's an honesty in them assessing their own lives, their relationships. But it does change from story to story, so just be aware of that. So when you look across the stories, the things that you can make connections with, we see a lot of characters in a time of crisis or at a moment of epiphany. And yesterday, Kate talked a lot about the importance of epiphanies and turning points and how, they can be small things, but there needs to be some kind of epiphany or some kind of turning point for a character to change and to develop. And to have a good story, a character needs to change or needs to develop in some way. So try and think about that with your own stories. Is there another epiphany that they can have, or is there another turning point that's going to happen in your story? And as a result of the epiphanies, they're often, left with really difficult decisions to make and the consequences of those decisions. If you think about, say, Seizure, for example, and Helen, going about her everyday life, a man has a seizure in front of her, And it's an epiphany for her, not so much the seizure itself, but the man who helps. And he was so calm and collected, and he knows exactly what he's doing, whereas she freezes. And that causes her, that moment and that man cause her to reassess her entire life, her relationship with Steve, who is not a particularly likable man. So, it doesn't have to be a big dramatic moment. It can be something small that makes them reassess things, that makes a turning point. Like in Kill or Cure, Kate actually talks about how that happened to her in real life, how she was living on a farm, she was quite isolated. They were rounding up sheep, I think she said, and one of the dogs was nipping at her ankle, trying to round her up, and she had this moment, this epiphany, where she realised that she was actually of a lower rank in the scheme of things than the dogs, and that caused her to write that story. So just little things that provoke some kind of reaction or choice or change in a character. You see a lot. And of course, we've talked about communication. That is a pretty consistent link with most of the stories, really, that the importance of effective communication. So different techniques that she uses and that you need to perhaps try and work into your writing where possible. So there's a lot of metaphors and extended metaphors. We talked about the extended metaphor of dark roots and the fact that it does really go across all stories. There's contrasts and juxtapositions in a lot of stories. If you think about perhaps Sea Burial and the juxtaposition of the protagonist's daughter dying of a heroin overdose and her husband Alan being a drug trafficker. There's a lot of foreshadowing. In each story there's a different mood, there's different tones, there's different atmospheres. So you think about Testosterone Club. It's ultimately a story about relationships and blokey culture and the way women are underappreciated, but it's also quite humorous in tone, whereas some of the other stories are really dark in tone. There's different narrative structures, so be aware of the narrative structure that your story is set in. And you can change that, but you need to be aware of it and you need to explain that. And there's a lot of personification as well, a lot of personification around the sea and imagery to do with the sea. Okay, so I wanted to run you through just, I guess, a rehash of the stories. We haven't gone through all of them in class, so please try and make sure that you are familiar with them all and that you have read the ones that we haven't read in class. I think that's really important just to get a holistic view of the text. So we did do What Thou and I Did Till We Loved. So it's about Rebecca and Beth. Rebecca waiting for Beth to emerge from a coma, realises it's not going to happen. So the real pathos and sadness of that what was a very loving, caring relationship that is now no longer. I guess there's a frustration in Rebecca wanting Beth to wake up and wanting to hear Beth talk to her, and it just doesn't happen. There's an extended metaphor of food in that story, and it's told in the first person. A pitch too high for the human ear we've talked about, and I've just seen a spelling mistake on that slide. We see Andrew and Vicky's relationship disintegrating, eventually ending in divorce, mostly because Andrew is unable to communicate, just because he's an introverted person and finds it increasingly difficult to be able to communicate with his wife. That's quite, I guess, in a way it's quite common, or it's quite stereotypical that a man finds it difficult to communicate. And again, that's told in the first person. We have Habit. I mentioned that before. We haven't read this one in class. An unnamed protagonist flying back from Colombia who has drugs hidden in her bags. The drugs are a way of her coping with the pain of having cancer, an incurable cancer, that, it's a way of her controlling the way that she ends her days, I suppose. The pun, or the funny part of the story, is that she's disguised as a nun, and we have the play on words there, habit. So a little bit of humour. First person, all an internal monologue. There's no real dialogue with other characters. So it's an interesting one. FLOTSAM we read in class, where an elderly woman returns to her the town that she grew up in as a child, and reflects on what caused her to leave the town, becoming pregnant, the father of the baby not wanting to have anything to do with it, and I suppose the difficulties around that. We have a lot of symbolism of the sea in that story, so that becomes quite important. And interesting, that one's told in the second and third person, so it contrasts to the previous stories. We have Cold Snap, which we also looked at in class, which tells the story of Billy and his a different child, an odd child, and we see his love of nature and his affinity with nature. And when his neighbours, who are from the city and don't really understand the place that they live in, they think it's a bit of fun to come down here. When he sees them mistreating nature, and we see his response to that, which Kate Kennedy cleared up for us yesterday, that he does actually, put a rabbit on the track and causes her to swerve. And we don't know if she dies or not, but he has caused her accident. So that was cleared up for us, which is great. So we see, the importance of nature, the environment, being able to communicate. So Billy finds it really difficult to communicate. It's very literal. And again, it's in the first person. RESIZE is a short story that we read in class, where a couple are going through marital difficulties, and they go through the process of having their rings resized, and somewhere through that process they find a way to reconnect. So, there's the symbolism of the ring, the symbolism of the car, that kind of thing. The Testosterone Club is not one that we read in class, and I would make sure that you do read it, please. So Monica's in a pretty unhappy marriage. Her husband's a bit of an idiot. He and his friends are, they have the Testosterone Club. It's the stereotypical Aussie bloke kind of thing. And we have her revenge, which is a nice, humorous end to the story. Dark Roots, again, one that we haven't read, but important because it does, gives its name to the whole collection. Shows the relationship of a 39-year-old woman who's dating a 26-year-old man, and the insecurities that go along with that. We see the pressures that women put on themselves and are put on women, societal expectations of what they should look like, just the absolute pressure and frustration that goes with that, and the way that she sabotages herself in the end, and that's told in the second person. Angel's another one that we didn't read. Talks about Mai and her adopted daughter, and them settling in as refugees to Australia, and the lengths that Mai will go to protect her adopted daughter. Communication's a really important one there. Mai chooses not to communicate. She likes to observe things and learn through observation, and people find that disquieting and don't like to trust her because of that. So that's quite interesting. Seizure's one I was talking about before, where Helen witnesses a seizure, and it's a moment of epiphany for her, and it causes her to reevaluate her life, and particularly her relationship with her not very nice partner, Steve. So that's a good one. The Light of Coincidence, again, one that we didn't look at in class, but that's a really nice one. Faced with a difficult decision, the protagonist needs money. He finds some drugs in a violin that he buys at a market. does he sell the drugs and get the money that he needs? He decides not to. He decides to do the right thing. And then it turns out the bow of the violin that he bought is actually worth $700, which is what he needs. So it's this idea of karma, and you do the right thing and you will have good things happen, kind of thing, which is nice. Soundtrack's a really lovely story. The protagonist, Rachel, is reflecting on her life and her somewhat difficult relationship with her daughter. She discovers that she's pregnant, and this alters the relationship between her and her daughter. So it flicks between past and present, and there's a lot of symbolism of music in this story, which is great. Direct action's one we looked at, so that's mostly to do with the father-son relationship. Our protagonist, who is an unemployed welder, he is an environmentalist, I suppose you could say, and he decides to take direct action to not solve a problem, but to bring awareness, I guess, to a problem that he sees within their community, and the ramifications that has for his relationship with his father. So there's a couple of stories that centre around the environment, so you can make links there. The correct name of things is one that we haven't looked at, but I would love you to read this one. I think it's an important one, and it hasn't been on the exam yet, so I think it's good to look at. So Ellen works in a Chinese restaurant in the 1980s. She is a university student. She is living with her not particularly reliable boyfriend, and she's faced with the decision: does she accept a job at the university, or does she do something else? And she's tossing up this sort of difficult decision. And in the end, she decides not to accept the job and to go diving up in Cairns. So it's this idea of rejecting formal education, I suppose, for a more, I guess, a world education, travel and adventure and learning through that instead. Kate mentioned that this is one that's sort of semi-autobiographical in that she did work at a Chinese restaurant and she had a boyfriend and that kind of thing. So it seems a little bit semi-autobiographical there. The Wheelbarrow Thief is one that we looked at. Stella and Daniel. Stella thinking she's pregnant. They have this dinner party, and over the course of the night, Stella comes to realise that Daniel is a bit of a phony. He's not perhaps the man that she thought he was. So it ends with her moving on from him. So then we have Sea Burial, and it's a very short one, but our protagonist learns that her husband, who was away a lot in business, was actually a drug trafficker, and that's how he paid for their life of luxury. And it actually ends with, and Kate clarified it for us, ends with her pushing him off a cliff, because we learn that 4 years earlier her daughter had actually died from a drug overdose. So when she finds out that her husband, imports and sells the thing that killed her daughter, her response is to kill him. And then, she gets a nice house and gets to continue her life of luxury. So that's interesting. And then lastly, we have Kill or Cure, which I mentioned as well. It's one we haven't read. Helen marries a farmer, moves to a farm, is quite isolated, finds it really difficult to settle in to a country life, is quite bored and frustrated and feels her life is stagnated. And I mentioned that this is partly based on a real experience that Kate had. So again, perhaps semi-autobiographical. Okay, so where to from here? You have the SAC, you have your options. Please read through them carefully. You have a little under a week, so you're doing this on Wednesday, so you've got a bit of time. Have a play around with them. Maybe there might be a couple that you're tossing up between. Why don't you have a go at planning or writing a couple of paragraphs on each and seeing which one you think works better or which one you feel more comfortable with. Once you've had a bit of a play with that and had a think, and decided, then reread the original story really carefully, noting characters' names and important motifs and techniques. Of course, it depends on the one you choose. There's the one with FLOTSAM, it doesn't really require you to continue the story or use the characters. So you can write a new story with new characters and a new setting, so you need to think that through really carefully. Once you've got an idea of what you actually want to do, I'd recommend doing what Kate talked about yesterday. Maybe sit down for 30 minutes with pen and paper, handwrite it, not typing, and just write for 30 minutes. And don't let your pen leave the page. Just write. See what you come up with. So 30 minutes writing, stop, put it down, walk away, come back to it after a couple of hours or come back to it the next day, read it, see if there's anything valuable in there. There might be a good character, or there might be a couple of sentences that you think might work really well. Remember that Kate said that your first draft will be crap. Okay, so do not go into this expecting to be brilliant the first time. Okay, that's why we do drafts. A draft is a way for you to work out what you want to do and kind of how you're going to get there. And once you've done your first draft, then we shape it and we pare it back. So remember that you're allowed a double-sided A4 page of notes plus the text. Okay. So, what to put on your A4 notes? Plan. Be very, very thorough in your planning, okay, so that when you come in on Wednesday, all you have to do, you know exactly what you want to do, sit down and start writing. You've got it all planned out, okay? On your A4 piece of paper, there can't be massive big slabs of writing. It should be dot points, okay? So you can't pre-write it at home and then just bring that in and transcribe it. That's not what you're supposed to do. You could also put notes about the story, character notes, notes on techniques, anything that you think is significant you can put on there. You might only need half a side, you might only need one side, and that's fine. It's up to you. So I would spend the next few days just going over your options, having a bit of a play with them, having a bit of a practice, rereading the story, and being as prepared as you possibly can so that by Wednesday you know where you want to go with it. Everything's pretty simple, and it'll be fine. Okay, good luck.